All right, there we are. So welcome to our Friday night Bible study on the book of Daniel. Tonight we're going to be studying Daniel chapter 11. Let's see if I can get my screen to advance. Here we go. And if you've been reading the book, Pastor Finley gives this title, The Prophetic Climax, because we're getting right up to the end. And it looks like we have else joining us. So I think that's Cindy. But before we get into the Bible study, let's start with a word of prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the wisdom and guidance we find in your word and for the encouragement that's there. We ask that you will be with us tonight as we dive into Daniel chapter 11. Lord, give us wisdom and understanding and help us to discern the insights and the truths that you have hidden here for us. We thank you, Lord, for we ask these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So let's move right in. I'm going to start off with a little bit of background. All right, so Daniel 11 stands in parallel with the previous prophetic outlines in Daniel. As we've seen in the earlier prophecies, they all follow kind of a pattern. In chapters 2, 7, 8, and 9, the message extends from the days of the prophet until the end of time. So it goes all the way from that point he's at in time forward, all the way to the end. In each message, a succession of world powers emerges. So it goes through one world power after another, so one government after another, and each one replaces the previous one. Now, Daniel 11 is going to be a little bit different because it talks about two world powers or earthly kingdoms fighting against each other. So they're in power at the same time. So we'll get into that, but it doesn't really break the pattern. It's just a little different the way it goes about it. These powers often oppress God's people, which is why they're listed, because there have been other great empires that you don't find listed in Daniel. You know, like China's been around for thousands of years, but China was not a persecutor of God's people. And back in the time of the Bible writers, they didn't even know about China. So it was not a factor and was not mentioned. Lots of other world, nations, great nations, powerful nations that are not described in prophecy simply because they don't play a role. Right. Now, each outline also climaxes with a happy ending for God's people. Right. So for those who are faithful to God and loyal to God, there's a happy ending. In Daniel 2, the stone obliterates the statue. Remember, the stone was Jesus. It sets up his kingdom, and his people inherit the kingdom. In Daniel 7, the Son of Man receives the kingdom, and of course, his people get to join with him in his kingdom. In Daniel 8 and 9, the heavenly sanctuary is cleansed through the work of the Messiah. So in Daniel chapter 11, we're going to notice as we go through it that it's going to follow three basic points. First, it begins with the Persian kings and discusses their fates and the time of the end when the king of the north attacks the holy mountain of God. Now, we'll get into what these symbols recognize too. Now, the king of the north starts off as a king who's actually geographically in a northern spot, but then it's going to grow into something more symbolic. The same thing with the king of the south and the holy mountain. Second, there's a succession of battles between the king in the north and that of the king of the south, and how they affect God's people is described, because God's people are often stuck in the middle. And when we get to the discussion on that, you'll see geographically why that's true, and then we'll also talk about spiritually why that's true. And then third, it concludes with a happy ending for God's people as the king of the north faces his demise by the glorious holy mountain. Such a positive conclusion signals the end of evil and the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. There are also some time prophecies in Daniel 11 that we're going to get into as well. There's a lot in Daniel 11. Let's start off reading the first 4 verses. Gary, you want to kick us off? Daniel 11, verses 1 through 4?
Yes.
Also, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than them all. By his strength through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others beside these.
All right. Now, one thing I need to point out, I remember this vision started in Daniel chapter 10. Remember when the angel said that he had, been held up, with the king of Persia. He was trying to influence
Persia.
Cyrus, and of course, the devil was working against him. But he says here, also in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. So he's just reminding Daniel that this angel was present when Darius first took over the kingdom. Because you remember the close relationship that we discussed that Daniel had with Darius. And of course, the whole situation with the lion's den and all that. So we know that the angel was there strengthening Darius, encouraging him, helping him to see the truth that Daniel was given before him. All right, so but what other things do we see here that remind us of some of the previous prophecies we've seen in Daniel?
I mentioned Greece.
Well, it does mention Greece, but in verse 2 it says,
More kings.
it says, behold, these 3 more kings will arise in Persia, in the 4th, so there's going to be a 4th king after that. So he's saying there's a king now. Who was the king at the time this vision was given? Cyrus. Right, in the 3rd year of Cyrus. We'll get to that here in a minute. So there's going to be 3 more kings. It doesn't really talk much about them other than there's 3 more kings after Cyrus. And then there's a 4th king that shall be far richer than them all. So this 4th king that succeeds Cyrus is going to be richer than all the previous kings. And by his strength, through his riches, he's going to stir up the realm of Greece. So he's going to stir up everyone against Greece. So there's going to be a Persian king, 4 kings after Cyrus, that stirs up trouble for Greece. And then it says in verse 3, there's a mighty king who shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. So after this, at some point down, there's going to be a mighty king who's going to come in and take over. And then in verse 4, it says his kingdom is going to be broken up into how many parts?
4.
Right? And remember in the earlier prophet when we had the beast with the 1 horn that broke into 4 horns, it broke off and 4 horns sprouted up, representing 4 kings. So we knew that was the Greeks, right? The mighty horn was Alexander. When he died, his kingdom was split up into 4 parts. We're going to see that in more detail tonight too. That's where the king of the north and the king of the south are going to come in. Now, when we went through the earlier prophecies in Daniel chapter 2, what was the starting point in that prophecy? Remember the statue?
That was Babylon.
The statue, right?
Babylon.
That was Babylon, right? There, Daniel said, the head of gold is you, meaning Babylon, right? In chapter 7, where was the starting point? Anyone remember? He had the beast. Go back and look.
It was Daniel's, that was his dream about Israel's the Gentile kingdom.
Yeah.
Right? Like the 4 winds are coming in and The four kingdoms.
Well, in the,
First was like the first four.
yeah, you had four beasts,
Yeah.
right? So the first was a lion with eagle's wings, which represented Babylon.
So God didn't do.
Yeah, it represented Babylon. This was, remember, in the
This is
first year of Belshazzar. So Babylon still had another 10 years
Babylon.
before it fell. So Babylon is still represented in this one. So again, it's at the point where Daniel is. And we go over to chapter 8. This is the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar. And this time, the vision doesn't start with Babylon, because Babylon's coming to an end. It starts with the kingdom that follows, which is Medo-Persia, which defeated it, because it identifies in verse 20, the ram which you saw having two horns, they are the kings of Media-Persia. And that was the first beast that is mentioned in the vision. So again, but that was very shortly in Daniel's future. That's where it was. So he's starting right where Daniel is, leaving out Babylon, because at this point in time, Babylon is just cruising. They're not really doing anything. In fact, they're starting their decline. And then in chapter 9,
Starts with Medo-Persia still.
starts with Media-Persia still, because we know the Medes and the Persian ruled for quite a while. But Daniel is still very much in here. And just like this vision we're in now, starting with the kings of Media and Persia. In fact, it says right after the king you have here, there's going to be 4 more kings. And how do each of those prophecies end? We talked about it earlier.
Something good happens to God's people. They get
Something good happens for God's people. So we can assume that this vision is also going to end well for God's people. Right? So that would be a reasonable expectation. Wouldn't it? If they followed those patterns all the way through, you would expect that Daniel would continue to follow that pattern. All right. So as we mentioned, the vision starts in Daniel chapter 10. Chapter 10, verse 1, it says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. The message was true, but the appointed time was long, and he understood the message and had understanding of the vision. So when it says the appointed time was long, we're going to see that term appointed time several times tonight. But that means that there's a set time where all this is going to come true, but it's long. So it's far off in the future. So there's some things that are going to happen in between. So we know that our starting point here is Cyrus. And I just bring that up because of the mention of the 4 kings. If we don't have that starting point, then it doesn't make sense. All right, Adiel's joining us. Got it? Okay. So let's take a look. Daniel 11:2 tells of 4 kings that rule in Persia after Cyrus. They are, and I had to go and look these up because I didn't know who the 3 in between were. I had to look it up. The 4th one I knew. But the first one is Cambyses, who ruled from 530 to 522 BC. The second one didn't even rule for a full year. The false Smyrtus, they call him that because he was a usurper. Right, so he didn't last long at all, just a few months, and then he was ousted by Darius the first. Now notice this is a Persian, not to be confused with Darius the Mede that took over when Babylon fell. This is Darius the first, a Persian, ruled from 522 to 486 BC, and then that brings us to the 4th king, who is Xerxes, who ruled from 486 to 465 BC. Now, does anyone know who Xerxes is?
Yes.
What do you know about Xerxes?
That he had, well, his ex-wife is Queen Vashti, and he chose Esther to be his queen.
Okay, interesting. A lot of people don't realize that much time had passed and where Esther actually falls in the timeline, but Esther is written well. It happens well after Daniel's time. right? Xerxes is known
Yes.
as Ahasuerus, which I probably mispronounced. He is the king found in the book of Esther. So now, since you brought that up, let's take a look at how Esther describes him. Who's next on here?
Kim.
Kim. All right. Would you like to read Esther 1 through 7?
Well, there's skip me for, skip me for a second. I gotta find my phone. I got it
Okay.
somewhere. Let
All right,
somebody
we
else.
can skip down. Carmen, can you read it? Carmen's mic is off.
Carmen's mic.
Carmen, your mic's muted.
Yep. I'm trying to find it here. Just prepare yourself. Esther
Oh,
1,
sure.
7.
It's a little book.
It's
not
a
real
little
big.
book. I skipped over it, so I was trying to find. Okay, so Esther 1 through 7. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia over 127 provinces. That in those days, when the king Azarias sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, and the nobles, the princes of the provinces being before him. When he shewed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan, the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace, where were white, green, and blue hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rings and pillars of marbles. The beds were of gold and silver upon a pavement of red and blue and white and black marble. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance according to the state of the king.
Now, notice the description here. Does this sound like someone with extreme wealth?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, extreme wealth. I mean, it says here,
Wanting it.
yeah, he was definitely flaunting. He called all the nobles and powers of Persia and Media. He said he had 127 provinces he ruled over. And it took them how long for him to show them all his glorious riches?
7 days.
No, the feast was 7 days. That didn't happen until
180 days.
180 days for it to see all his stuff. I mean, that's a long time.
Yeah.
I'd invite y'all over to come see my riches, but that would take like 5 minutes. And we'd be done. So 180 days. Wow. And then he had a 7-day feast after that. And it said they had beds of gold. They were served with gold vessels. I mean, and just the building itself was very opulent. And if you read how this 4th king is described in Daniel, it says here, a mighty, excuse me, in verse 2, not verse 3. The 4th shall be far richer than them all. Well, does it sound like he was probably far richer than, well, he's far richer than anyone that we know of, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So definitely, you don't see any other kings bragging about having that, even when the Babylonian emissaries went to Jerusalem and the king was showing them all his wealth. It didn't take 180 days. He took him for a tour through the temple and showed him all the holy items of God. That took about a day, and that was it. So, I mean, this was vast wealth. So we can see how he fits that description. But how did he stir up all against the realm of Greece? Now, you won't find this in the Bible, just the prophecy. It doesn't, the fulfillment's not the Bible because the fulfillment didn't actually involve God's people because it was fought up north away from them. But can anyone tell me what Xerxes did?
Oh, he had like a big feast, and he expected Queen Vashti to be a part of.
That's the story of Esther. But how did he stir up the realm against Greece?
Oh, okay.
All right. Let me give you a little history. All right, so Xerxes invaded Greece in 480 BC and defeated Leonidas at the Battle of Thermopylae. Now, for those of you who are movie buffs, the movie The 300 was based on this battle. And the Greeks under Leonidas held him off because they made a stand on a narrow stretch of beach. And of course, his vast army, because he had a huge army, could not bring their numbers to bear because it was a narrow front. It wasn't until Leonidas was betrayed and somebody showed Xerxes how to get around them so they could attack from behind and just bypass them altogether, that the Persians were able to move on. But as a result of that, the Persian Empire was able to invade and take over much of the southern regions of Greece and expand the empire. So that was how Xerxes stirred up his realm against Greece. Up until then, the previous kings had sent emissaries to Greece, to try to get them to surrender, and they would basically refuse, say, hey, come and get us. Well, the ones when Xerxes sent them, when he sent them there, they actually killed them.
When we were in Greece, we saw this place and we saw the huge monument and the engravings in it and the story and everything. It was pretty interesting.
That was pretty interesting. Yeah, they basically told him, you want our land, come and take it, is what they were saying. So he did. So they didn't take all of it. He didn't have enough might for that, but he took the southern region. So he's the king that we see mentioned here that stirs up the realm against Greece. So then we move on to verse 3 and 4. And it says, then a mighty king shall arise who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. Now, he didn't come immediately after Xerxes, but we do know that this is talking about Alexander.
It's Alexander.
It's Alexander the Great, because it says in verse 4, when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided for the four winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, because he didn't have any children, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted even for others beside. While his kingdom was still there, when it split up into four parts, it was never the same. They never were able to unite together, and it didn't expand anymore at that. But if you look at some useful facts to help us identify it in Daniel 8, 3-8, it says, then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had two horns, and two horns were hot. The two horns were high, but one was higher. This is the Medes and Persians, right? Saw the ram pushing westward, northward, southward. See, when it pushed westward, it was pushing into Greece. No animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, Greece, right, across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him. And there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. It said, therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it, four notable ones came up toward the four winds of heaven. And when I've got a map I'll show you here in a bit, you'll see how that was taken. But if you go down to verse 20, the angel is interpreting. He says, the ram which you saw having two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. Alexander was the first king to unite the whole empire of Greece. As for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. You can see the parallel. So here he's obviously talking about Greece. Now, upon his death, Alexander's empire was split up amongst his 4 generals. Those generals are Ptolemy, Cassander, Seleucus, and Lysimachus. And here's the map. All right, so if you can see this, can everyone see it clearly?
Mhm.
All right, so the dark
Yes.
green down here in Egypt, that's Ptolemy. That's the area he ruled, which makes sense because we've all heard of, the Ptolemy dynasty in Egypt. Well, this is where that started. This is where it came from. Then if you look at Seleucus, well, he's got a huge area. Up here, Mesopotamia, where Media Persia was, all the way over towards India. Because we know that
Actually,
Alexander went all the way to India.
I don't see Seleucus. Maybe. Oh, there it is now.
Yeah, you see it?
Yeah, I see it now.
It's kind of the light blue-green color.
No, yeah, I see it. It's just that on the screen, the Zoom thing, has the little options like with participants, chats, share screen. That was blocking Seleucus.
Okay.
So
Right.
was Mesopotamia all the way to
Tria.
He goes,
where was it?
he goes,
Seleucus?
Seleucus, it starts right here where you see Mesopotamia is, right, like in the center of the screen. And it goes off to the east. It goes off the picture I have here because Alexander went all the way to India.
Oh, wow.
So his kingdom went all the way over there. Now, to be completely honest and straightforward, he didn't really control that region because Alexander was just going through and conquering everybody submitted rule. But once he was gone, these kings, they focused on their little area. They probably had some influence over in that area, but as far as if anyone had attacked at that end, they really didn't have the forces to defend it. Then you have these 2 other kings, Lysimachus, which you see was up here in the area, it says Thrace here, which we would know as Turkey these days. And then Cassander is this pink region, which would be over to where Greece is. Now, those 2 kings, we're not going to talk about them at all tonight because if you look at the map, where is Israel?
Right. There's the Red Sea, so it's kind of like.
You can see Israel is right there in the region where Seleucus and Ptolemy, where their kingdoms come together.
Yeah.
And it shows actually this narrow strip here where Ptolemy has right there along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. That's Israel. So what you're going to see happen over the next couple hundred years, these 2 kings are going to fight back and forth. And who's caught in the middle? Israel. So you've got the king of the south. Well, who's south of Israel? Ptolemy, that's Egypt. And the king of the north, well, who's north of Israel? Seleucus. Right, Seleucus.
How do you pronounce his name?
Right, he's north of Israel. So we're going to be starting off the Seleucus dynasty. That's the north king, the king of the north. Ptolemy dynasty, that's the king of the south. So hopefully this map will kind of help you understand what we're reading as we move into these next few verses.
So that was Babylon then, right?
That was Babylon. Yeah, Babylon
Yeah.
would have been up here in Seleucus. Now, the interesting thing is the king of the south, Egypt. Well, from what we saw in the Bible, Egypt was very defiant when it came to God. They defied God constantly, right? Babylon took it a different approach. Babylon, we know, represents false worship, Right? Babylon says you can worship your God if you want to, as long as you worship these other gods too. They really didn't care who you worshiped as long as you worshiped their gods. So Babylon represents false worship. Egypt represents defiance for God. So you're going to see as we move through here, the king of the south represents a power that is defiant against God. The king of the north is going to represent a power that represents false worship, who's going to lead people astray. I went too far. Here we go. So let's read the next few. Daniel 11, 5 through 14.
You can jump back to Genesis.
Kim, do you want to give this a shot?
Yeah,
All right.
okay. Also, the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And at the end of some years, they shall join forces. For the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand. But she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. But from a branch of her roots one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army, enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. And he shall also carry their gods captive to Egypt, with their princes and their precious articles of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Also the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. However, his sons shall stir up strife and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through. Then he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife. And the king of the south shall be moved with rage and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude. But the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy. When he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cast down tens of thousands, but he will not prevail. For the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times many shall rise up against the king of the south. Also violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fall.
All right. Interesting. So you see there's a lot of back and forth between the king of the north and the king of the south. We're not going to detail each and every one of these specific prophecies that are in here, but we're going to take a look at one because I think it's really interesting and it leads into all the others. But in Daniel 11:6, it says, at the end of some years, they shall join forces. So it talks about the king of the north and the king of the south. They're going to try to unite the two together. And it says, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. It says, but she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand, but she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. Now, so it sounds like they're going to unite. The king of the south's giving his daughter to the king of the north. So it sounds like a marriage arrangement, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't work. What happened? Well, after the empire of Alexander was split up, the king of the south ruled Egypt while the king of the north ruled Syria. In Syria, Antiochus, who was surnamed Theus, ruled the north. In Egypt, Ptolemy Philadelphus ruled the south. So this is the person we're going to be talking about here. He's the one that actually built the great library of Alexandria. You've all heard of that, right? That happened under his rule. So he was a very powerful and influential king. So, and this, the events of this verse take place about 70 years after the death of Alexander. So we've had a few kings in between. But Ptolemy Philadelphus, king of Egypt, carried his daughter Bernice to Pelusium, and then to Seleucia and Syria, where he met with Antiochus, king of Syria, to give her in marriage. So they actually gave marriage. the interesting thing was Antiochus had a wife already. He put her aside to make this political arrangement, to have this political union, and he married Bernice. But now, as soon as Ptolemy Philadelphus died, Antiochus dismissed Bernice because at this point in time, she no longer served a purpose politically. And he took his former wife back again. Now, how do you think his former wife felt about that? She really didn't like him at this point because she's not being treated very well. She actually poisons him and dies, and then puts her own son on the throne because, of course, he was the child of the king and he was the firstborn, so rightful ruler. But now that leaves Bernice in a precarious position, right? Not only was she put out by the king, but now the woman that she replaced has essentially taken power. So she goes into hiding. But Laodice found Bernice, had her and her son murdered. And then, of course, once news of that got down to the south, down to Egypt, that renewed hostilities. And they started going to war again. And there's a whole lot more detail after that. But you can see the amazing detail that is in just that one verse, all the things that are in there. And it brings a question: why does God reveal such detailed aspects of these kingdoms? Do we need to know that much detail?
Probably not, but it just shows that he knows what's going to happen.
Absolutely. Right. It knowing that much detail, I mean, because it's that marriage arrangement, that death has no bearing on us today, but the fact that God foretold it exactly as it happened decades, or actually centuries before it happened, just reinforces that God does know the end from the beginning. God knows the future. God has it all under control.
And when you just read that in Daniel, it's just like, I really have no idea what they're saying, until it's broken down. If
Yeah,
you're
you
just
don't-
reading over it, like, I totally lost.
Yeah, totally lost. Now
Uh-huh.
we could sit here and do a history course and look at all these details that are missing here.
That's okay.
We'll be here for a couple hours. So I
That's
wanted
all
to take one and
Uh-huh.
detail that and give it to you so that you can see that. Now, if you're interested, I would encourage you to go back and, you can do some research and find what all these others are. But it's so interesting that he had that much detail put in there. If this were going to be something where I felt like spending a couple hours doing tonight, we'd do that. But I don't think y'all want to be on here that long. So let's take a look at a text. Whose turn is it to read? Yeah, Ellen, if you'd like to read, we're going to read a text in Isaiah 46, verses 9 and 10. You there?
Oh, wait. Wait.
I was saying Ellen, but I don't see her. I think she may have stepped off camera.
Okay.
She may not have heard us. So Nicole's going to read it for us. She's next on the list.
Isaiah 46, 9 and 10. Okay. Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will do all my pleasure.
All right, so think about those texts. How much basic Christian theology is found in these two verses? I mean, God says, there's no other like you. There's none like you, right? Is there anyone else who knows the future in the detail that God does?
No.
It says he declares the end from the beginning, from ancient times, those things that are not yet done. He says, my counsel shall stand and I will do all my pleasure. So when God says he's going to do something, then you can take that to the bank. You know it's going to happen. Right? So what's the great hope we can take from these verses?
God is in control.
God is in control.
And that
Plus,
he loves us and wants the best for us.
he loves us. He wants the best for us. And if you've peeked and looked at the end of the book, like, yeah, I know we've already done a Revelation study. We've read the end of it. We know how it ends.
Yeah.
We can take great comfort in that because God said that's going to happen. We know that's going to happen. Now he tells us there's a bunch of other stuff that's happening in between. So when we see that, while it may not be pleasant if we're going through it, we can know that, hey, this is a sign that what God has promised is getting nearer and nearer. That can give us some encouragement.
Mhm.
So now let's dive back to Daniel, because now we're moving on, marching on in the kingdoms. We just talked a little bit about Media Persia, Greece, what happened there. Now let's move on to the next one. And we're Daniel 11, 16, 28. Let's break this one up a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's go 16 through 20. Who's next?
Mind you, back if she's interested in questions, or you can see your face.
Yeah, Ellen. Yeah, Ellen's back there.
Oh, yes.
Ellen,
Mhm.
yes. Would you like
you
to
want-
read? Would you like to read a few verses? Daniel 11, 16 to 20?
Sure. Okay. Daniel 11:16. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. He shall stand in a glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her. But she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many, but a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach, he shall cause it to turn upon him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. Then shall stand up in his riser of taxes, the glory of his kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither anger nor in battle.
Interesting. So what you have coming in here is the next power. And this is describing Rome coming in, right? Because it's coming into the Holy Land and the coastland, and it's consolidating all of that. And this is leading up to something. So this is talking about the Rome conquest of that region. Interesting thing it says here in verse 20, there shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. We're going to identify that person. Interesting enough, there's only one mention in the Bible of a Roman king or emperor imposing taxes on God's people. But let's keep reading. So that's stopping point right there. Then we're going to go on starting at verse 21. 21 to let's go down through 24. And that's
Cindy if she wants to read.
yeah, Cindy, if you would like to read, you can read that. I see you're muted though. If you
No, it's okay.
yeah, if you don't want to read, that's fine. Adiel,
Yes.
you read that verses 21 through 24.
Sure. And in his place shall arise a vile person. Is my mic on? Oh, yeah, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
And in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. With the force of a flood they shall be swept away from before him, and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. Um, he shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time.
Right, so we notice after the one who imposes the taxes meets his demise, one comes in who is described as being a very vile person, who is not given the honor of royalty, but he's still going to rule nonetheless. And it mentions in here in verse 22, right, it says, with the force of a flood they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. Now, who's the prince of the covenant?
Jesus.
Jesus.
Jesus. And when was he broken?
At Gethsemane.
At Gethsemane, right? On the cross. So these are the events leading up to the crucifixion of Jesus. And then, of course, it says some things are going to happen to that king at that point in time. And then, where are we at? Verse 25 now?
Mhm.
All right, I'll read these next few, 25 through 28. It says, he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south. Here we go again, right? Going after the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacy shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land. So it's talking here about the king of the north. He's actually going to be turned against the holy covenant. So God's covenant, he's going to actually get to a point where he attacks that. Now we do know that after Jesus's death, towards the end of the first century, the Romans started turning on God's people. Right? It started off persecuting the Jews because they were just downright rebellious and non-cooperative, and then the Christians, because the Christians were associated with the Jews because they were so much alike. I mean, their faith was virtually identical, just that the Christians accepted Christ while the Jews had rejected him. And then we know that there comes a time where the Roman emperor will actually declare war and try to stamp out Christianity by killing Christians. There's a 10-year period there where, I mean, they do all kinds of things: feed them to lions, burn them at the stake, actually tie them up to stakes and burn them as torches while entertaining the people at the Colosseum so that they can see the others being fed to the lions at night. I mean, it was really, really depraved situation. But we can find some similarities between what we just read and other portions. So let's look at comparison verses. Daniel 11:16 said, but he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power. If you look at Daniel 8:9, compare that. It says, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. So remember here, it's talking here, the little horn was initially that's that horizontal spread of Roman power into the Holy Land.
Mhm.
So that's what this is talking about here, that first growth, that expansion. Then we see Daniel 11:20 says, there shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. You find that, let's compare that to Luke 2:1-5.
Jerry.
Jerry, you want to read that for us?
Sure.
What?
That's right.
Oh, about who that was?
And it came to pass, okay. And it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So all went to be registered, even everyone to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house of lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. So was that while they were there these days? So can we go further?
No, you can stop there. So we see here talking about Caesar Augustus. He had a census done now through all the lands, but this was also a census in the Holy Land, and the census was for the purpose of taxation, right? So he's taxing the Holy Land. So when it says here, there shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, that was him. That was Caesar Augustus. Okay, so we can see how that brings us up to here. Then verse Daniel 11:22, which we read, where it stated, with the force of a flood they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. You compare that to Daniel 9:25-26. It says, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again in the wall, even in troublesome times. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And the end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Now, what's talking about a flood here is not talking about a flood of water. It's a flood of people. The Holy Land was just overrun with Roman soldiers. I mean, when they destroyed Jerusalem, this is well after Jesus' death, I think around AD 70, they actually surrounded the city with the army to make sure they had enough people out there that no one could flee, escape. And they went in and did that. So you had that flood right there. And of course, it mentions Messiah. And then if you look at Matthew 27:33-50, we have the event here where it's talking about Jesus' crucifixion. I don't think we need to read the whole thing. But if we look at it, just hit some high points. 33-50. Says, when they had come to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, a place of a skull, they gave him sour wine mingled with gall to drink, but when he had tasted, he would not drink. Then they crucified him, divided his garments, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Interesting, you see here, again, prophecy being fulfilled exactly as it was predicted. And they put up over his head, this verse 37, I skipped down there, the accusation written against him, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Then it goes on. Now from the verse 45 I'm at now. Now from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness over all the land. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of those who stood there when they heard that said, this man is calling for Elijah. And then we go on down here, verse 50, and Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. He died. Very next verse says that, of course, the veil in the temple was torn from top to bottom. So you see there the actual execution. Of course, when it talked about casting lots, who was casting lots for his garments?
Roman soldiers.
It was the Roman soldiers. That was the flood that came in and broke the people. They broke the Prince of the Covenant. And so where that's coming from. But even amid all the political and historical events, you notice that Jesus of Nazareth, the Prince of the Covenant, is revealed in these texts. He's a central figure in several of those texts we looked at. So how does this help to show us that despite all the upheaval and political intrigue, Jesus remains central to Scripture? Right. So do we know? Well, why were there so much details given? Why did
So we
Jesus?
could, so we could trust it, trust what's being said.
We could trust what was being said. Remember, Jesus said when he was telling you, he says, I tell you these things so that when you see them happening, you'll remember, right? So you'll believe. We were given so much detail that it should have been painfully obvious to everyone who Jesus was.
Mhm.
But yet he was rejected by the religious leaders of his time. Because they just weren't looking at the right places, they weren't paying attention, and he didn't fit what they were wanting the Messiah to be. So we got to remember, it's not about us, it's about him. But Jesus is central. All of this was leading up to him. The things that happened after that are given to us as, again, guideposts to help us know where we are and what's coming, so that we will know that what God told us is true and that we can be prepared to receive him. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the symbols we've used here. Glorious holy mountain. In Old Testament times, this expression referred to Zion, the capital and heart of Israel, and geographically located in the Promised Land, which made sense because Jerusalem was built on a mountain, right? So it would be the holy mountain. The temple was up at the top. So that kind of made sense. After the cross, God's people are no longer defined along ethnic and geographical lines, because what happened after Jesus' death and they started persecuting Christians, they scattered and they took the message to all the Gentiles. So at that point in time, God's people were no longer in one place, but they were scattered all over the world. So the holy mountain after Christ's time must be a symbolic designation of God's people spread throughout the world. So up until the death of Jesus, the holy mountain is a reference to God's people in Israel, centered right there around Jerusalem. After Christ's death and the message going out to the Gentile, it becomes more symbolic as a designation of God's people all over the world. And we talked about this a little bit already. The King of the North, this name first geographically designates the Seleucid dynasty, which was just north of Israel. But then it later refers to pagan and finally papal Rome as they came in and took over, because you got to understand, remember that Babylon represented false worship. We came in, Rome did pretty much the same thing. You can worship whatever God you want as long as you worship Caesar. as well. So that's false worship. And then eventually papal Rome, which we've already talked about, has replaced the ministry of God with the ministry of men, and God's laws with man-made laws, which again is false worship. So as such, it does not describe a geographical location, but the spiritual enemy of God's people. In addition, it should also note that the king of the north represents a counterfeit of the true God, who in the Bible is symbolically associated with the north. And if you look at Isaiah 14:13, you can see this reference here. Isaiah 14:13. And it says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations." Oh, I'm reading the wrong one. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
"For you have said in your heart," I was reading verse 12, verse 13. That's right, they go together. "I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north." So that's where you see that correlation to the north. So that represents the false worship that Satan wanted to set up. Now, the king of the south, as we discussed, first designates the Ptolemaic, I'm saying that not right, I know, dynasty in Egypt, south of the Holy Land, but as the prophecy unfolds, it acquires a theological dimension. So if you were to think of something, remember, Egypt represented defiance of God as opposed to false worship. So if you were going to look at something that represents defiance of God today, you would have to say that atheism would be the thing that comes to mind. Because atheism teaches that there is no God. It doesn't try to lead you into some false sense of worship. It just says, why worship all? There is no God. There's no purpose for anything, right? Just might as well just do what you want. So that's
Would it be just atheism? Because what's happening now in the world with all of this climate stuff, they're getting into a lot of earth worship and pantheism. So would that be the king of the south?
well, that would be false worship.
That's more of a north.
It could, some of these things could blend the lines, because as
Yeah.
we saw in the prophecy here, eventually the king in the north is going to overwhelm the king of the south and
Mhm.
take over. So they will end up having an alliance of sorts. So you may see some commingling leading up to that. So seeing the earth worship,
Mhm.
things of that nature, that could kind of be a blending of the two. But the predominant for the South has got to be defiance of God, which would be atheism, as opposed to false worship, which would be, worshiping the earth is false worship.
Yeah.
Pantheism, that's false worship.
Mhm.
But they have their similar roots. Right. So now let's look at the tail end of this. So we've gone through Rome. So what happens after Rome? Let's read the rest of the chapter and see. Verses 29 through 39. And
May I read the last one?
Are
Read
you
what?
gonna divide it up?
Oh, wait, 45 is the last verse.
Yeah, we're not going through 40. Yeah, we're not going all the way 45. We're just going down through 39. I'm sorry. I jumped
Okay,
ahead there.
So may I read up to
Yeah.
30?
Yeah, you can read it. Start at
And-
verse 29.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's my age. All right. The northern king's blasphemies. At the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved, and return in rage against the holy covenant, and do damage. For he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. Those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now, when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. And some of them understanding shall fall to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. Then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard nor regard any God. For he shall exalt himself above them all. But in their but in their place he shall honor a God of fortresses, and a God which his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign God, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain.
All right, so there's a lot in there.
Yes.
Let's take a look at some similar verses in Daniel. Daniel 7:19-22, where Daniel writes, "Then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. It says, I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom." You see some similarities there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The little horn was making war against God's people, and this northern king here was making war and prevailing. And then Daniel 8:10-12 says, "And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the hosts and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. By him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgressions, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered." Does that sound similar to what we read in chapter 11?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Sounds very familiar, right?
I want to add another thing. Also, in this chapter 7, I think verse 11, it also says, "I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame." So also Daniel chapter 7 verse 11 has some similarities with Daniel 11.
Absolutely. There's some definite similarities there. And now interesting, remember this is happening sequentially. So we know now that this is all happening after the time of Jesus,
Yeah.
right? Because it's flowing through the sequence of events, just like he did in all the other prophecies. Some people would want to say, well, this happened before Jesus's time, which makes no sense because we've already read through here about where the Prince of the Covenant was broken. So we know this is after that. But let's take a look at verse 1133. It says, and those of the people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by the sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. What does that say about the fate of some of God's faithful people?
They're gonna be killed.
Yeah.
They're gonna fall by the sword.
Going to fall by the sword, right?
Right.
Will be martyrs.
Yeah, and it says here, these are people who understood the truth and they were still instructing many, so they weren't holding silent.
No, they were still teaching.
They were still
speaking
teaching.
out.
Which is the next question, right? It says, so what does this text say about what some of these faithful people were doing before they were martyred? Well, they were teaching the truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were spreading the gospel, doing what God asked them to do. Now, when in history did we see this happen? Can you give some examples?
Well, during the Dark Ages,
Yeah.
when they
The
were
Dark
up,
Ages, yeah.
It was a big
This
one.
isn't something that happened for just a few years. This went
this
on
was
for centuries.
1260 years, wasn't it?
For a long, long time. We've all
Yeah.
heard of the Inquisition.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Now, the Inquisition started off as a way to get rid of what the church would call religious zealots, I guess, where these were people who disagreed with the official church teaching and they wanted to follow the Bible instead. So, of course, the first thing the church did was outlaw Bibles. You wanted to get on the Inquisitors list, all you had to do was own a Bible. You were on the list. And in many places, if they found you in possession of a Bible, you were burned at the stake. So it was awful. And then, of course, you heard of the Spanish Inquisition, which was unreal. Because when they started off, they started persecuting Muslims. They said, you need to convert or leave. Well, a lot of them converted. Well, after they went through and there were no Muslims left, they went through and they started persecuting the converted Muslims because they didn't think they were sincere. And then it just got into all kinds of things. All the Inquisitor had to do was to suggest that you were a heretic and you were punished. That was a great way for them to get rid of political opponents, political enemies. A lot of people had nothing to do with religion. They just were not in favor politically. And so they were branded a heretic and ousted. And it is terrible. But for people we can think of,
John Huss.
Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther didn't die, but he was persecuted.
He was persecuted.
And they tried to kill him.
Wycliffe.
Wycliffe was killed, yes.
Wycliffe.
Wesley, yeah.
Waldensians.
The Waldensians,
That's the one I was
They were
thinking of.
massacred.
They were massacred.
massacred en masse
Yeah.
wherever they could find him.
Now,
Actually,
when you mean history, do you mean like outside the Bible?
yeah, outside the Bible.
Okay, because
None of those people are in the
with
Bible.
yeah, I know, but I mean, like, because Stephen was also a martyr, but he was within the Bible.
Yeah, Stephen was within the Bible, and he was actually stoned by the Jews.
Yes.
Right, so that was not the King of the North. That
Oh,
was
no.
the Jews.
Okay, that's a different martyrdom.
The Jews they did not have clean hands when it came to martyrdom. They martyred quite a few people.
Yeah.
But you can see history is just filled with people who died for the gospel and were killed by an entity that claimed to represent God, right? Claimed to be God's people.
Yes.
That's the King of the North, right? So what's the message for us today from that?
That's
Now,
gonna happen again.
it's going to happen again. Yeah.
Mhm.
We need to stay true to, we should keep working even though we are threatened with martyrdom.
Which we're
Yeah.
not even threatened right now, yet we don't, a lot of us, I'm talking about myself, don't go to try out, to tell others like we should.
Yeah.
And we're not even threatened with martyrdom right now.
Yeah, right now, we are not threatened with martyrdom. We are free to speak. Try that.
Mhm.
We're free to share,
Mhm.
and we should be taking advantage of it. There are places in the world where they're not free to do that.
That's true.
And they do take their lives in their own hands when they share.
And pretty
So-
soon we won't be able to do this online pretty soon either, because a lot of things are already getting taken off right now. Somebody put the Lord's Prayer. They said their friend put the Lord's Prayer on Facebook, and underneath it they put that it was disinformation, misinformation. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, pretty soon. And I know Doug Batchelor said on one of his sermons that they labeled it as hate speech. So
Wow.
yeah, pretty
Well,
soon.
if you
Fair.
teach strictly according to the Bible, when you hit on certain topics,
Oh yeah.
you're going to be
Yeah,
labeled
it's
as
gonna be
hate
labeled
speech.
as hate.
Yeah,
Oh,
it is.
of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's certain topics, just because God said so,
Right.
doesn't mean it's, I mean,
It's not
I read
politically
those
correct.
things. You look at Jesus, I mean, he condemned people.
Yeah.
He condemned the actions, but yet he still showed love for the people. For the woman who was caught in adultery,
Yeah.
did Jesus say, hey, that's okay?
Nope.
No.
No, he told her,
No.
go and sin no more.
Sin no more.
Yeah.
He told her, don't do that again. Okay. So he loved her. He hated the sin.
Exactly.
So, same thing with us. When we express our disapproval for the sin, it's okay to hate sin, but don't hate the sinner.
Yes.
But because you hate the sin and you're not saying, hey, I'm giving you a free pass, it's okay, do what you want,
Mhm.
it's hate speech. That's just the world we live in nowadays. So it's coming.
Yes.
We can see it. And actually
Coming
have a question on that when we get down to the end.
Actually, I want to answer this question with a
Okay,
verse.
go ahead.
Like message here for us today. It's found in Matthew chapter 5, verse 11. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my name's sake, or for my sake. In verse 12, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
Yep. So the key there is when you're persecuted for his sake, right?
For his sake, right?
If
you
you're
are
getting
blessed.
persecuted because you're being a dummy, that's on you.
Yeah.
Don't blame that on anyone else. But
Yeah.
if you're being persecuted for speaking the truth with love, hey, if you want to persecute me for that, go ahead.
Yes, then
We
you are
should be okay
blessed.
with that. All right. Now, considering what we read in Daniel 7 and 8, who is this power? And why is it so important to us, despite social pressures? Remember, we just talked about hate speech, to stay
Yeah.
firm in our identification of it. So who is this power?
Papal Rome.
Papacy.
It's the papacy, right? I will say this, don't go around saying it's the Catholic Church. Because when you say that, you're lumping all the Catholic believers in there and saying it's them. And it's not them,
No.
right? It's the power behind that whole organization,
Right.
right? There's a lot of good people in the Catholic Church. I know a few. They're great people.
Yeah.
They may not have all the truth yet. They may not fully understand it. But we're going to see here in a little bit of verse where we know that eventually they will. All right. Now, Daniel 11:33, when we read that, it's interesting that at least in reference to these verses we read, Martin Luther identified the abomination of desolation with the papacy and its doctrines and practices. Now, notice he didn't say the church, because remember, what church did Martin Luther belong to?
It was a Catholic.
Catholic.
Catholic Church, right? He was a Catholic. He identified this with the papacy, its doctrines, and its practices, not the whole church, just the power that was running, right? So this correlation of Daniel 11 with Daniel 7 and 8 reinforces the view of Luther and many other Protestant commentators that the institution of the papacy and its teachings constitute the fulfillment of these prophecies in history. And this was the belief of Protestants all through the ages, and still many of them do today. But you'll see now a lot of them are downplaying this or trying to find other explanations. You see that a lot in some of these evangelical Christians who are trying to kind of cozy up to the papacy. So they're starting to kind of blur the lines a little. But for a long
And not
time,
just Christians, the Jews and Muslims are all doing it now too.
yeah.
Yeah, not just Christians.
Well, we did read there. Well, we're going to see here in just a minute where the king of the north is going to make allies. So let's read on. It's Kim's turn?
Yep.
All right.
Oh, wait, no. Yeah, it is.
Is it Kim?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait,
you
before you go, what are the Jews and Muslims doing again?
Cozying up to the papacy.
Yeah,
Oh,
Well, it shouldn't surprise us,
no.
right? Nobody who studies Bible prophecy should be surprised by that at all.
no, of course not.
Right.
That's not
Shouldn't be.
surprising at all.
All
All
right.
right, what do you, 1140 through 45?
Yes, you're going to take us right to the end here.
Okay. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand: Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him.
All right. So interesting. So we have here, it mentioned in verse 40 at the time of the end. Well, what is the time of the end? When does it begin and when does it end? Do we know?
Started in 1844.
Well, yeah, let's look up some verses here and see. Daniel 11:35
Yeah, we know.
says, some of those understanding shall fall to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. So we know that this was talking about the dark ages, right?
Yeah.
But it said until the time of the end. So had they come to the time of the end yet?
No.
No.
No, they had not. Verse 40. So we know it's not in the dark ages. Verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. He shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. Now, it sounds here like that's kind of kicking off the time of the end, right?
Yeah.
So the king of the south shall attack the king of the north. So when did that happen? We'll get to that here in a second. Then verse 45, I say, he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. So it sounds like the end of the time of the end is the end of the king of the north.
King of the north, yeah.
Right? So that's the end of the time of the end. Well, let's look at the next chapter, which we haven't gotten to yet. Daniel 12, verse 4 says, but you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. And then verse 9, and he said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. So the book of Daniel is going to be sealed till the time of the end. But it said in verse 4, but you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. So the book is going to be opened up the time of the end, and people are going to gain knowledge. When did that happen?
That was the end.
When did people start to really understand Daniel?
Well, it's when they started discovering about the sanctuary.
Right.
1844.
When they thought Jesus was going to come.
Right. They
Yeah,
didn't
they
have
didn't
full
really-
understanding.
So I want to say it was after 1844, really, because they didn't really have full understanding until after the disappointment.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's in the early part of the 1840s, they really started studying Daniel,
Mhm.
and they had a better understanding of Daniel than anyone did prior to that time. Better understanding than any of the reformers that come before them, but they didn't have full understanding, so they made some mistakes. Just like a lot of the earlier reformers, they had more light than the people before them, but they still made mistakes.
Mhm.
But they just still didn't have everything. And then Daniel 12:1-2 says, "At that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation. Even to that time, and at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt." Now that sounds like
The end.
the end.
That's
Very end.
That's
coming.
the end of the end time,
Yeah.
right? And that's the second coming. All right, so let's see if we can get a little bit more precise here. All right, so some further interpretation. The king of the south attacks the king of the north. When did that happen? Well, that happened
I
in the
was
French
wondering about
Revolution.
the French Revolution.
Remember when we studied Daniel? I know it's been not Daniel, Revelation. It's been two summers ago, I think.
Yeah,
It's been a while since we studied chapter 11 and the prophecy of the two witnesses, which detailed what happened in the French Revolution. But it's amazing what happened there. The French Revolution, they did away, right? Because remember, up at that point in time, the papacy was controlling the government, and the
Mhm.
government was being very oppressive. So they said the government has to go, the church has to go, and they ushered in atheism with open arms. And then they went and they actually started worshiping the goddess of reason.
yes.
Remember that?
Yeah.
And that lasted for about 3.5 years. They did that before that toppled on itself, and they got so carried away with guillotining everyone that eventually they started guillotining the people who were leading the revolt. And they fed on themselves, and eventually it fell apart. And who came back in to pick up the pieces and
No,
reunite people? Well, it wasn't the Pope,
it wasn't the Pope.
But-
It was
but
Yeah.
Christians.
Christian.
Christians came in and prevailed. So the king of the south attacks the king of the north. The French Revolution attempted to eradicate religion and defeat the papacy, but failed. This is also prophesied in Revelation 11, as we discussed. Number 2, the king of the north attacks and defeats the king of the south. The forces of religion headed by the papacy and its allies will eventually overcome the forces of atheism and will form a coalition with the defeated enemy. You see that now working, where the papacy is going out. He's trying to form
Yeah.
coalitions with people of different beliefs and bring them all together. And of course, they're all going to answer to the Pope. So we see that in progress at this point. That has not happened yet. It's in progress. Edom, Moab, and prominent people of Ammon will escape. What do you know about Edom, Moab, and Ammon, or Ammon, or however you want to pronounce that? Where were those kingdoms, those people?
Weren't they surrounding Jerusalem?
They
or
were.
Israel?
They were in the promised land, right?
That's a good one. Yes.
Right. And these people were distant relatives
Yeah.
to the Jews, if
Yeah.
you will.
Yeah.
So these are God's, they're a branch of God's people who have wandered off, because remember, they went into the pagan worship and all that. But it says here, some of these not counted among God's true people will join the fold in the last hour. So in the final moments of history, you're going to see a lot of God's people come to the truth and are going to join and stand with God on God's side against the little horn power and that coalition. So that's going to come. You're going to see people coming out from these various peoples. Number 4, the king of the north prepares to attack the holy mountain, but comes to his end, and forces of evil are destroyed and God's kingdom is established. That's pretty self-explanatory. When he says there, he set his tents between the holy mountain and the sea, you know, he's preparing to besiege it. And you can read in Revelation, as we're going through there, about the beast from the sea, the beast from the land there, where they form a coalition to try to force people to participate in false worship, to worship the beast. So you're going to see that, but it's not going to prevail. In the end, God's people will prevail. Well, God will prevail. So now here's a discussion question. Now there's a lot more detail in that chapter. If we wanted to spend another couple of hours going over the history of it, and we can dig up all kinds of dates and details. I'm not going to do that. If you want to do that research on your own, you can, but I think we hit the high points.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What does he mean by the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow at his heels?
The Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow at his heels.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have a lot of details on that, but if you think about that, the Libyans and the Ethiopians, what do they represent today? You know, there's a couple of things. Libya is a Muslim country,
Mhm.
right? So that could be a
Yes.
reference to the Muslims
Okay.
that'll be joining him. Now Ethiopia is interesting. Ethiopia for a long time was a Christian country.
Yep.
Right? During the times when Christians were being persecuted in Rome,
Mhm.
they were living free in Ethiopia. And they were able to worship freely. And they really became quite strong there right up into the time of so that when the Catholic Church sent missionaries down there, they found that these people were already Christian. But it took a long time, but they eventually converted them over. So these could be people who were in the fold and leave
Mhm.
and joined with the papacy now. I'm not
Okay.
saying I know all the answers, but
Yeah.
those answers kind of fit in and make sense.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not saying that I'm some great theological guru who knows all the answers to all these questions, but
Yeah.
those seem to make sense.
Okay.
I could be wrong. I don't know.
Okay.
But yeah, I didn't find, and again, it's kind of hard to find a historical, definite answer to that question because some of this hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
So I could be barking up the wrong tree entirely. I don't know.
Okay.
But good question. And I'd encourage
I
you.
agree.
I encourage you if you really want to know more about any of these things, do some research. If you find something interesting to share, let us know.
Yeah.
The question I had here, how can we draw comfort from knowing that in the end, God and his people will be victorious? Well, let's start with the obvious one. Who is God's people?
Those
The ones who
that
keep his commandments
One who keeps
and
his
have the
commandments.
faith of Jesus.
Would
There we go.
you consider yourself to be one of God's people?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, then
Yes.
it's reassuring to know that you will be victorious.
Yeah.
That's a plus. What else can we get from that?
It'll give us
The end.
hope during the trouble. I mean, when we're going through all these
You
trouble,
read?
because you know that in the end, it's all going to work out.
Yeah, we just read in Daniel
Yes.
12, which we're going to study next week. There shall be a time of trouble such never was since there was a nation. Now, we like to think about the dark ages and the persecution went on there, that was really bad, and we're all glad that we weren't there then. But what's coming is going to be worse.
That's kind of scary.
We can't even, can't even imagine it.
Can't
how it works.
imagine that at all, but
Yeah.
it's going to be worse. So,
Yeah.
and God's being completely upfront and honest with us about it, right? But we can know that when that happens, just hold tight, stay firm, like the people who were persecuted in those days were victorious, we can be too. All right, now we notice in Daniel 11, 27, 29, and 35, the phrase, the appointed time, was used repeatedly. What does that tell us again about God's control of history?
He's got a plan for everything.
He's got a plan for everything. There is a time that God knows, we don't, but God knows when his plans are going to take fruit, when they're going to be fulfilled. So we know that whatever we're going through right now, it's not going to be forever. Whatever bad thing that comes at us in the future, it's not forever. God said there's an appointed time. When that time ends, that ends. So that's comfort. All right, and that brings us to the closing prayer. That was a little bit longer. I knew we were going to go over an hour because there's no way to do Daniel 11 in less than an hour. But I knew if we tried to get all the details in there, we'd be here for another hour and a half. So thank you for your participation, for your questions, your input. There's much more in there to dig out. Feel free. If you have time over the weekend, pull out your Bible, get an encyclopedia, do some reading. Google's a wonderful thing.
Yes,
There's been so much research in Daniel. I did Google a couple of things. So I started writing outlines. I said, no, if I do this, I'm going to be here all night. But there has been so much research into it that you can find the fulfillments of most everything in that chapter, except for, of course, stuff that hasn't happened yet. All right, let's.
Except for which ones again?
Well, the ones that haven't happened yet.
The ones that haven't happened yet.
Yeah.
I thought you mentioned
Remember
some
that those last 4 or 5 verses we read. Some of that stuff is in the future. It hasn't happened yet.
Right,
So,
right.
Like the question about the Libyans and the Ethiopians, I don't know for
Exactly.
sure.
Yeah.
I tell you what I think, but that's what I think. That's not. Don't anyone go talk to the pastor and say, you know what Bob is teaching. Bob is giving his.
Don't worry. That's not gonna happen. At least
yeah,
not.
Bob's giving his opinion. That's what Bob's doing. All right.
If you don't mind, just excuse me, I just wanted to apologize for the disruption. Shirley was having a hard time getting on, and so I tried to get her on the phone and here, and then I didn't know how to get her muted. But anyway, I'm sorry about the distraction, but
that's okay. We were able eventually. If something like that happens, I can always mute it at my end. I just didn't know where it was at first.
I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to make it a problem.
Fine.
No, it's no
No,
worry.
you're fine.
We're glad you were here, and hope both of you were able to hear during all that.
That was fine. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's bow our heads and have a word of prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you again for your word, Lord, and for the gift of understanding you've given to us. We thank you for the gift of your Son, who is so prominent in what we studied tonight, and for the promises that you have in store for us in the future. We ask that you will be with us, Lord, in our daily lives. Help us to apply this knowledge. Help us to grow our faith and stay strong in your faith, Lord, so that we can join your people on that final glorious day when your kingdom comes to full fruition. We thank you, Lord, for we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Remember, next week, we're going to conclude our study of Daniel chapter 4. Again, anyone who's watching this, you can see if you have prayer requests or want more information on this Bible study series or any others, you can email me. My email's right there. I do want to let you know I'm planning on taking a little bit of time off at the end of this study, because I know a lot of you want to go ahead and dive into the rest of the book, because remember, it's understanding Daniel and Revelation. I'm not quite ready to make that leap yet, so I'm going to need a little bit of time.
Take your time.
But if I'm going to try to come up with something, I don't want us to stop meeting and stop studying the Bible together. If somebody has something you'd like to lead out, or if we could do like we did the last time between Was it between the sanctuary and Daniel where we studied Matthew?
Matthew.
We can do something like that for a
So-
little bit if y'all want.
Yeah, that's fine.
We'll discuss it
So
more.
we still have those other books.
Yeah, we still have the other books. We can just move right into the next one. But
Yeah.
we'll discuss that in further detail next week, so you'll know what's coming. Because I don't want to leave anyone in the lurch, and I don't want to stop doing this because we have so many people who do enjoy it.
Yes.
Well, they may not be with us here tonight. A lot of people watch it tomorrow when we air it. So for those of you
That is
watching
correct.
this, thank you for watching it when we air it. But I want to thank you all for participating tonight, and I hope you have a blessed Sabbath day.
I can't speak
Thank
for
you.
everyone, but it was my
Sabbath.
pleasure.
Yes, thank you.